Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I welcome you all to today's meeting of the Public Petitions Committee, and as always can I ask everyone, whether it's members or in the gallery, to switch off any electronic equipment because it does interfere with our sound systems. Agenda item 1 is consideration of new petitions. The first item of business is consideration of 2 new petitions, and the committee will take evidence from one of the petitioners. I should also note that John Wilson has given us apologies, and I welcome Jim Eady, and also David Torrance will not be attending today as well. So the first petition is PE 1506 by Alison Tate on behalf of the Robert Burns World Federation Limited on renaming Glasgow Prestwick Airport to Robert Burns International Airport. Members have a note by the clerk despite his briefing on the petition, and members will note that Willie Coffey MSP has indicated support for the petition. He would like to attend today's meeting but he has another engagement. Could I welcome our witnesses? Good morning, you're very welcome. Thanks for coming along. We have Alison Tate, the Chief Executive, Jane Brown, President, and Jim Thompson, Senior Vice President of the Robert Burns World Federation Limited, to the meeting. And can invite Alison Tate to make a short presentation of around 5 minutes to set the context, after which I ask a couple of questions. And I know that in particular Chick Brodie and also I think Jackson Carroll have got particular interest in the petition, and I'll ask them to follow my questions. Alison Tate.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Mr Convener, for allowing us to come along and put our case forward for the renaming of Prestwick Airport. To give you some background, the Robert Burns World Federation was founded in 1885, the main objectives being to advance the education of the public about the life, poetry and works of Robert Burns, and in furtherance thereof, to encourage and arrange competitions among the general public, students and school children, to stimulate the development, teaching and study of Scottish literature, art, music and language, that's all Scottish literature, not just Burns, to conserve buildings and places associated with Burns and his contemporaries, and to strengthen the bond of fellowship amongst members of Burns clubs and kindred societies throughout the world. Club societies, individuals and corporate bodies who support the aims and objectives of the Federation may be admitted as members. However, as a leading authority on Robert Burns, his life and works, we interact on a daily basis with many people, both members and non-members. Robert Burns is a global icon and recognised worldwide. He's one of the top literary figures in the history of the planet, comparable with all the greatest literary characters. Culture Minister Fiona Hislop said, "Robert Burns is Scotland's greatest cultural icon, recognised and celebrated all around the world. His legacy is of incalculable value to Scotland and the country's image abroad." However, it's not the sentimental aspect of Burns which is of importance and which brings us here today, but rather the business case. Prestwick Airport is Scotland's other international airport. Renaming the airport would immediately identify its geographical location, right in the heart of Burns country. We see it as a positive step forward, having the international airport almost in sight of Robert Burns' birthplace. As a gateway to the region, this will be seen by potentially millions of passengers. It would be a fitting and relevant tribute to the memory of Robert Burns, but more importantly, renaming the airport could have an impact on the market as it services an area rich in culture, heritage and tourist attractions. We envisage it would increase the profile of the airport in terms of Burns tourism, with an opportunity to improve passenger footfall to the area. This would be of advantage not only to Ayrshire, but to Dumfries and Galloway and the wider Scotland. There's an opportunity here for the southwest of Scotland to capitalise on tourist value, everything from spend on tour guides and ancestry research to golf and hotels. I could go on. From a marketing point of view, it's possible to capitalise on Burns throughout the airport and potentially increase footfall. Due to security, footfall in airports nowadays is mainly due to passengers as opposed to the cafe culture which existed previously. In physical terms, Prestwick is Scotland's largest commercial airfield, although in passenger traffic terms it sits fourth in place after Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen. However, this has the potential to be improved. Passenger traffic peaked at 2.4 million in 2007, following 10 years of rapid growth, driven in part by the boom in no-frills airlines, especially Ryanair, which uses the airport as an operating base. We understand there has been a significant reduction in passenger traffic, with around 1.1 million passengers passing through the airport in 2013. The Federation has worked closely with Scottish Government for many years with regards to the promotion of Burns, as both organisations realise the value which Burns brings to the Scottish economy. It's reported that Robert Burns is worth nearly 160 million to the Scottish economy. The Federation continue to encourage overseas visitors to Scotland, with Burns being one of the greatest focus points for those who visit here. Fiona Hislop also said, "The strength of culture is challenging us to think differently, to do things in different ways." So we're doing things differently. We're working in partnership and collaborating with many other organisations nowadays, and we'd be delighted to work in partnership with airport management to provide assistance wherever necessary to progress the airport in its future growth. We at the Robert Burns World Federation are keen to see the airport used to its full potential, as this would have a positive impact on employment in a region of high unemployment, with several areas currently running at above the national average. Burns was the ultimate cultural activist, challenging the political mores of the day and envisioning a different future. We envisage a different future for the airport. Thank you for listening. We're happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your evidence, and could also encourage Jane Brown and Jim Thompson, if they wish to be involved, please catch my eye for any of the questions that we're going to have. I have a couple of quick questions. Looking at the petition, it seems to me that really what you want is a change in branding. What evidence do you have that a change in brand would make customers more likely to fly to and from Prestwick Airport?
I think Burns is a global icon. He's known worldwide, so his name is so well known. If it was attached to the airport, people from all over the world would recognise it immediately. They may not recognise just Prestwick.
Also, Mr. Convener,
Mr. Thompson? Yeah.
Whilst I don't have any statistical evidence, there's certainly anecdotal evidence in terms of this past year we had several visits from overseas, particularly the United States, where they were flying from Pittsburgh or Los Angeles or wherever into London, and thereafter having to fly to Glasgow or Edinburgh, and they were quite clear that they would have preferred to have flown to an airport closer to where they wanted to come. And whilst there's an opportunity for them to do that via Ryanair, I don't think that, for example, the Carnegie Institute, when they were coming, particularly wanted to use that vehicle so that they fly to Glasgow. And I think there are people who would travel not only from the United States of America and Canada, but from the Far East and other points.
Okay, my second question is, I had a look at some other exercises and brand changes across the UK earlier today, and you probably know that Wick Airport's changed to be called John O'Groats. I think Sheffield is Robin Hood and Liverpool is John Lennon. They are different, of course, but have you compared their experiences in terms of whether that's changed the footfall that these airports have had after the change of name?
I can't comment on that one.
But in terms of branding, we haven't carried out the commercial exercise that would take, because we don't have the facilities to do that, Mr. Convener. But in terms of branding, these airports, and if you look at Northern Ireland as well, the George Best International, are following a trend that starts in America, I would venture to suggest. And they've done that not for any... I don't think that Nottingham's changed to the Robin Hood Airport for any other reason than they felt that was the right thing to do, in terms of where they are, where that sits with their heritage and culture, particularly their history, and the framework of what they're trying to do in the West Midlands. The bottom line to it is, I would be saying to you today that whilst the commercial argument I would think takes primacy, there are times when you have to say to yourself, is this the right thing to do? And I would venture to suggest to you that this is the right thing to do, because it tells the world who Scotland is.
Thank you for that. I now hand over to Chick Brodie for further questions.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. It's a difficult petition for me, this, because after years of publicly seeking the objectives of the petitioners, I think I should be sitting at that end of the table rather than here. So you'll have to curb my enthusiasm in time, Convener. Just on the last point, I, in fact, have contacted the chief executives of Liverpool and Belfast Airport. And Belfast, on the day it announced the change to George Best, had over 1,000 people worldwide come in to see the rebranding. As you know, there's an exercise currently going on with a management consultant who is a key player in all of this. I had a meeting with him 2 weeks ago to talk about various things. I just wonder, have you spoken to him, or do you have any plans to talk to him?
I know who he is. I did some background research. We haven't spoken to him yet, but if that was going to be acceptable, then I would certainly go down that route, yes.
It might be worthwhile. On the point of the rebranding of the other airports, you haven't made any contact at all with the other airports, reference, Belfast, Nottingham, Wick, which I didn't know about. Have you had any contact? Do you plan to have any contact in terms of the impact that rebranding would have?
Yeah, I think the plan is we would, if this was going to be an option, then yes, we would do some further research and find out some more information from them.
How many countries is Burns translated into?
52 languages his poems and songs are translated into. But there's more depth to it than that. If you look, for example, at universities with Scottish literature departments worldwide, then you can go from Tokyo all the way across to San Francisco, and you will find, and they promote Scottish literature in places like Singapore better than we do in this country, because not just Burns, there are many other great Scottish literature figures, and I mean, we're sitting near this, quite near the tallest statue in the world, to a literature figure in terms of non-military, but it's to a literature figure. So quite clearly Scotland does venerate the literature of its heritage, but other countries value it as well. And when you think that there's been over 2,000 prints of his works worldwide as well, countries like Russia have produced stamps with his head on them. We're the first country in the world to do that. He's internationally a staple. If you went to Harvard University, Mr. Convener, then you would require to study the Harvard Classics. One entire volume of the Harvard Classics to this day is the works of Robert Burns.
Yeah, I just think it sort of was a rhetorical question, but as you said, over 50 languages, but the reach is works are sold in, last figure I had was 195 countries internationally. So clearly the brand is very important. Have you also had any contact with the Ayrshire colleges and the engineering companies? Because clearly Prestwick is a unique, and I would say this, wouldn't I, is a unique airport in that it has very significant engineering canvas behind it in terms of the colleges, and also a great experience in terms of maintenance, repair and overhaul, which makes it attractive for large body jets, which have difficulty finding any airport that can do that worldwide. Have you had any contact at all with the college or Spirit? Or
I know the principal at the new Ayrshire College, Heather Dunk, yes, and due to my involvement with Young Enterprise, I'm in contact with some of the aerospace firms, yes.
One last question, if I may, Convener, although I could go on until 12 o'clock. With my limited business experience, far be it from me to challenge what was said last week at the committee meeting, that what we think gives the airport the best chance of growing its business and returning to profit. Branding wasn't particularly mentioned. Have you had any contact with people who, I mean, clearly you market the Federation and do it very well, but who might be involved in marketing of this nature? If not, can I encourage you to do so?
Yes, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm tempted to say it will be at some stage named as you wish, but that's not in my gift.
Thank you, Chip Brody. Jackson Carlow.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Sorry, it's the good cop, bad cop routine. I'm absolutely agnostic on this issue, like the Deputy First Minister was in giving evidence last week. I represent the west of Scotland, and until fairly recently lived for several years in Troon. So I'm very well aware of the downturn in traffic, if I can put it that way, at Prestwick Airport, and I'm very, very keen that a business case is put together which allows the airport to survive. But I want to test some of the concepts in all of this, because I mean, for me, this is not about promoting Robert Burns. It's about securing the future of the airport, and that is actually what underpins my concern. So, is your argument that by calling it Robert Burns International Airport, more people would then want to come on holiday in Ayrshire?
I think that's part of it, yes. It would make it more recognisable. The name would make it more recognisable as an airport. It would pin its geographic location. Yes, we would like to encourage more tourist traffic to Ayrshire, Dumfries and Galloway and the surrounding districts. I think that there are a whole lot of issues in there.
And therein is a slight concern I have, because it has been seen by now as a sort of secure gateway location into, you know, the broader Scotland. Is there a sufficient additional market out of Burns within Ayrshire to secure the viability of the airport?
I don't think that the Burns traffic alone would secure the viability of the airport. There are loads of issues. You're probably more aware than I am. In a previous life, I had quite a lot of work and contact with the airport. And without doubt, the biggest single issue in terms of Prestwick Airport and its viability has been absentee managers. The landlords have been off at the other side of the world, and as a result of that, investment has just not taken place. And when I think back to even 15 years ago, in terms of the stature of Prestwick Airport to what it is today, and the Burns name will not bring on its own that investment, nor will it bring the amount of footfall that's going to double from 1 million to 2.4 million in terms of passengers. However, the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum opened, 18 months, 2 years ago, and it's well past its 1 millionth visitor. So to say there's no Burns tourism would be a misnomer, but it won't make Prestwick Airport survive on its own.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that sounds realistic, for which I'm grateful. We've talked in a sense about people coming into Scotland, but the airport depends upon people flying from Scotland as well, in order to justify the investment airlines would make in routes. And of course, that brings us back to the whole issue of pricing and location and all the more complicated issues that underpin the success and viability of any particular airport. And that's where I'm not myself sure I understand. Would somebody from Glasgow or elsewhere want to fly from Prestwick because it was now called Robert Burns, as opposed to any other airport that was more convenient or price competitive? And I can't actually believe that. So I just wonder whether, in the event that everything else can be put right, this is something that is helpful. Is that where you're coming from, as opposed to believing that this is the cart before the horse, if I can put it that way?
Yeah, you're right. And people will only come from Glasgow or the outlying districts to Prestwick if the flights are there, going to the destinations that they are looking for. Yes.
So I guess my final point or question is a bit, I think, where the Deputy First Minister was. The government have taken over responsibility of the airport, not because they want to, but because they feel they have to. I don't think there's any pretence that the Deputy First Minister is an airport magnate with the ability herself to manage such a project. She and the government will require the very best management team in order to do, possibly with the support of the government, what is required to turn this airport around. I think everybody thinks this surely must be its last and possibly its best chance in recent years to make that happen. So I then wonder, is this really something for MSPs or the Scottish Parliament? Or really is it something that if the management team who are undertaking this exercise on behalf of the government believe is the right thing to do, then we should respond to that initiative rather than trying to advocate them towards a route that they might not have the evidence themselves to support?
There's several arguments in there, to be honest with you, in terms of what comes first. And what we would say to you is quite simply that in terms of the management of the airport, Luton and Stansted work perfectly profitably in and under the shadow of Gatwick and Heathrow. Glasgow and Edinburgh are both successful airports. Prestwick can work equally as successfully under their shadow. And as to whether the name is important or not in terms of the managers, I don't think it would really make that much odds to them. As at the end of the day, I think this is more an issue for this particular building in terms of how they want to see Scotland seen, not only within Scotland but abroad. So what I would suggest to you is that the naming of the airport, whilst the management team's views and ideas should be taken into consideration, I think the decision on that lies with this building.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Amit Taggart.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. And good morning, panel. It was really just to give you an opportunity. What kind of? I've read that there's been Facebook and social media sites. Could you explain of what you have done before arriving here?
Well, there was such a support through Facebook. That was the reason we decided to do the official petition. The official petition only got something like 260 signatures. But the Facebook site continues to gather support, which is quite pleasing. So, yeah, it's really just through the social media that this has come about. Yeah.
Has there been any other campaigns involving local people in the area?
There was a campaign some years ago which was unsuccessful. That was before my involvement with the Federation. I think possibly about 10 years ago.
There's been repeated attempts by various groups to try and influence the previous management or owners to rebrand it away from the pure dead brilliant and all that sort of thing. I can understand why they did that. I don't have an issue with that, to be honest. It's just that everything has always fallen on deaf ears because the owners just didn't see any kind of value in taking a Scottish poet and saying to the world, this is important to us. They didn't see any value in that.
Thank you.
Could I just ask sort of wider questions? We've talked, obviously, rightly about the rebranding exercise, and I understand the points you're making. But if you look at the development of airports within Scotland, one of the key functions was the use of the Route Development Fund, and that was something that initially Labour had brought in, and in fairness, the current government are looking at a form of that to ensure that local airports have the marketing support they can have to try and develop companies to have an interest in individual airports. Is that something you think it would be very useful for Prestwick Airport in the longer term?
I think it certainly would be, yes. There are a number of businesses in that area already, but the more we can attract to the area, the better. Yes, definitely.
As I'm sure you've picked up from your own supporters within your own organisations that many tourists and indeed the business community might well, drive to London or take the train to London for flights rather than use Scottish airports. And I think the general strategy I would encourage would be for the development of a lot more direct flights from Scotland, irrespective of the airport. And as you say, Edinburgh and Glasgow have done particularly successfully on that. The other issue, I think, is that Ryanair are an excellent company and they've used the base at Prestwick. But in general terms, it's important, I think, to try and develop a range of carriers, because the danger of being dependent on one carrier, as I know from my own experience in Inverness, is that you are very, very reliant. If that goes wrong, you've got real problems. And I think Dundee has found that in particular. I know you've got, I think it's Oscar Travel have looked at some charters in the longer term. Do you know if there's any other carriers being encouraged to come to Prestwick?
I would imagine there are, yes. And the more we can attract, the better. Prestwick Airport did do so much better a few years back with lots of different destinations and things. And I've got to say, it was wonderful to see the airport busy again. Unfortunately, that's taken a dip at the moment, but I'm sure we can get back there with the right partners in place going forward.
The key, of course, is to encourage other partners to come in that is not going to alienate your existing partner, because we don't want to do that either. So that's a delicate path.
You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
It's better that we widen the set of people we work with.
Well, certainly talking to the business community, what I'm picking up that they're quite interested in is the sort of full service airlines, and that in the past was historically, your British Airways of the world and so on, which gives you the advantage of through ticketing and interlining, the ability to go directly to cities across the world. Is that something that you're conscious that Prestwick have looked at as well?
I think they should.
Again, if I go back,
Mr. Johnson.
the only Scottish director I knew who worked at Prestwick under the previous company from New Zealand was Bill Barr. And when I spoke to Bill about this, they weren't interested. And I said to him about through ticketing, because that's certainly a big issue. If you, for example, if you want to go on holiday, particularly to anywhere across the Atlantic, you're required to go via some kind of hub airport. And now whether that hub airport's in the United States or whether it's in the United Kingdom is really irrelevant to the flyer, but you can't do that from Prestwick. And you haven't been able to do that for quite a number of years. And that was the point that was made to me quite clearly by the people from Pittsburgh last year in terms of them coming here, that they would have preferred, you know, to be able to fly into to Prestwick via through ticketing from the take-off point.
I realise that that's not within your gift, but it is part of the wider arguments. And the final point for allowing Chuck Brody back in is that clearly access to London is crucially important, but we all know that Heathrow is effectively full. Gatwick's not far away from that as well. So the great advantage if you're going to a European destination is to try and have direct flights to Europe. You will still obviously need access to London, but the best will in the world, even with plans to develop Heathrow, we are going to be a long time off before we see any increased capacity. And also, it's going to be lucrative long-haul destinations that Heathrow is more interested in. Short-haul has been cut dramatically within Scotland. We've seen flights cut from Inverness, from Belfast, and so on, and that will continue because that's where the money is. It's not on localised flights. Would you agree with the strategy then should be to go directly from Scotland to European destinations?
If you take Scotland as an example at the moment, if you want to fly to direct to European destinations, you have to go from either, well, you can go from Aberdeen, but you're going basically from Glasgow and Edinburgh. And if you take Jet2 as an example of a carrier, they're flying daily from Glasgow and daily from Edinburgh to the points of high interest, the Mallorcas and Algarve, etc., and the European continent. And I don't see why some of that business can't come to Prestwick, to be honest. I think there's got to be some kind of drop-off, because 5 years ago we were doing it, and it was working. And, I mean, I'm not blaming anybody, but the issue is, as I say, is absentee landlords maybe don't make the best managers.
And I did say finally earlier, but I say finally again, that I think if you have, when we have seen new developments of new carriers coming in, like the Virgin Red service, which got the slots at Heathrow that BMI had to give up because of competition regulations. These flights have gone to Edinburgh and Aberdeen, but they haven't gone to Prestwick. So there is an argument there about where companies wish to fly to. But I'll perhaps bring Chick Brody in.
All you just said, Convener, highlights the uniqueness of Prestwick. If I can bring us back to the branding, we didn't talk about some of the changes that are needed, not just with Prestwick, but with other airports like airline passenger duty and things like that. I just wonder, again, in terms of looking at the uniqueness, Prestwick is the only airport in Scotland that has a rail head next to it. Now, I've had conversations with Network Rail. I wonder if you've had conversations at all with the implications of running, well, first of all, discussions improving the railhead, but discussions in terms of how it might be better applied in relation to the airport. You can call it Thomas Shanter Rail if you like. I don't know.
I think under new management, I think as Prestwick improves, the rail links will improve as part of the whole plan. I know there are also plans to link up Prestwick and Kilmarnock and Edinburgh, and so there are lots of things being discussed at the moment. And I think it probably will come as part of the bigger parcel, as these things progress. The airport and the rail links will all improve, I would hope.
The rail link as it stands at the moment is a pretty routine, regular, well-contrived service on an electrical line that doesn't really need a lot done to it. And there's an overpass from the airport to the station. I think the station facilities could probably do with being improved if the footfall's going to increase. But I see that as quite minor in terms of how the rail operation would work in conjunction with the airport.
I think that's going to happen. Can I just go again, coming back to the uniqueness, if I had was selling brands abroad and exporting, and we know that Scotland's exports are growing quite rapidly, I wouldn't mind a brand that said my product flew out of Robert Burns International Airport. Now discussions have been held in terms of what might be happen by pulling cargo traffic up from the north of England, for example, up the way to Prestwick, as opposed to going through and trying to get it out of Heathrow, which currently is, bordering on almost the inoperable. Have you talked to any large companies who might export and who would look to, use the brand as a means of just increasing their visibility abroad?
There are a fair amount of exporters in Ayrshire itself. I know that, having previously worked with the Chamber of Commerce, who are based in Prestwick Airport, funnily enough. So yes, there are discussions there to be had, because they may be interested in using the brand also. We have links with, for example, Isle of Arran distillers who use the Robert Burns brand. We've just this past year made links with Robert Burns, the transport company. So as part and parcel of what we're doing to advance the Federation as an organisation, then yes, there are lots of discussions to be had with various different organisations and companies.
Prestwick is unique in terms of the length of runways, the weather. It's also a backstop for any hopefully unlikely terrorist activities. It has a railhead. It has a huge engineering backdrop. And I expect I know the answer, but isn't it the case that with proper branding, this could be a quite exceptional, unique airport that supports the other passenger airports in Scotland?
Absolutely.
In terms of uniqueness, I think this is a unique opportunity as well, Mr. Rory. I think Scotland has a great opportunity here to say something to the world about who we actually are and what's important to us as a nation and what heritage, culture and history actually mean to the people of Scotland. I just see it as a fantastic opportunity, and it may well be passed up for all sorts of good positive reasons, and I wouldn't be critical if that happened. I'd just be disappointed.
You and me both. No more questions. Sorry.
Sentimental point of view, I know it's not about sentiment, but I had the honour to lay a wreath at George Square in Glasgow on the 25th of January at Burns' feet. And looking round the rest of the square, there was all these worthies with their wonderful statues and all their accolades written round the plinth and the letters after their name and everything he had done. And I laid the wreath and I stepped back and bowed my head and I looked up, and there was one word on that plinth: Burns. That's all that needed to be said. And I think around the world everyone knows what that means. And this is a sentiment, that's why I'm here, I'm so passionate and sentimental about it. But everyone would know that Robert Burns International Airport was in Scotland, and it was near his birthplace. And East Ayrshire Council and the Fleece and Galloway Council have worked very hard recently to make a Burns Trail. They've joined together so that anyone arrives at Prestwick would start in Alloway, where he was born, and make his way through to where he died and where he's buried. And it's a great thing that's just happened between the two councils, because it used to be them and us, and now they've all joined together. So that's a good step in the right direction, so anyone coming over as a tourist would get that information straight away. So it's just another wee string to the bow there.
I think that's a very interesting point. Can I just ask whether any other members wish to add any further points? Well, I think this has been. I think this is a very good petition, and the next step is that the committee need to look at where we go with the petition. But I think we've gone beyond just the branding and the name. I think we've asked, and you've answered, really interesting questions about whatever happens about name. We need this airport to succeed, and there's a whole series of other factors come into play, including route development, development of current carriers, new carriers. And our general philosophy in Scotland about are we flying from Scotland or going elsewhere, because that's going to be the real key. So in terms of next steps, certainly my own view is that we should certainly continue this petition and do some further investigation. Members will be aware that there was a discussion at the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee involving Adam Ingram and Nicola Sturgeon, and I think that was a very useful debate. I certainly think it's worth taken some advice from that committee, which is that we continue the petition to await any relevant recommendations that may be on the issue to the holding company board and ministers by the recently appointed senior advisor. So that means that we wish to continue it to get the technical advice from these key people, and obviously then we'll come back and debate this petition at a later stage when we've got the key information. But obviously we'll keep you up to date with this, and I think all the committee have showed a big interest in the work that you're doing. So can I, before I ask you to stay for 1 second and ask whether the committee are agreeable with that course of action, or whether there's any other course of action members would like to carry out. Thanks, McDonald.
Thanks, Convener. I certainly agree that the petitioners have certainly put forward a strong case for their argument this morning, and I would be content to continue the petition. It's certainly worth waiting to see what recommendations come forward from the recently appointed special advisor, who I believe has only been in post for less than 2 months. So, yeah, I would certainly agree with that course of action. Presumably, we're asked that the committee be informed at an early stage once the special advisor comes up with his recommendations.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Check, Roger?
Yeah, no, I agree. Absolutely. I think it might be helpful if the petitioners perhaps contact some of the people who were suggested to broaden and deepen the petition, if that's possible. It might bring a totally different perspective as to what was discussed last week at the Infrastructure Committee.
Thank you for that. Amber Taggart?
Just agree to continue the petition and obviously of the course of actions that has been indicated.
Jim Eady?
Just endorse the views of other members in terms of continuing the petition, certainly during the period while the management consultant is looking at the commercial viability of Prestwick.
Jackson Carlo?
Content.
Content. Thank you so much. So as you've picked up, all members are very keen of the course of action that we've identified, and we'll obviously keep you up to date with developments. And can I thank you, all three of you, for coming along and participating so helpfully to the committee, and I suspend for 1 minute to allow our witnesses to leave. Thank you very much. If I could just resume our committee, we're now on the second current petition. It's PE 1509 by Lee Wright on Aberdeen to Inverness rail travel improvement. The committee had invited Mr Wright to give evidence, but unfortunately Mr Wright couldn't appear today because of work commitments. Members have a note by the clerk, the spice briefing and the petition. I think members are probably aware that there has been some developments in this petition. I think on Friday the government announced a new package for this route. I'm not sure if that was in response to our petition coming up before us today, but if it is, I'm very grateful to that. But just to summarise the press release. Thank you, Mr. Lee. So the investment's 170 million. I won't read all the work, but just to summarise some of it, there's going to be redoubling of the track between Aberdeen and Inverurie. There's platforms at Inch and Elgin will be extended, and some signalling improvements as well. I think if you look at the petitioner's view in this, I think the petitioner is very concerned about the poor frequency of the service and the length of time it takes to go between these two cities, which members will know have a certain affinity for at least one of them. But I think the key is that there's going to be an hourly service planned and a reduction in the time it takes to go from Aberdeen to Inverness. I think one of the big difficulties on the route is the fact that so much of the route is single track, which does cause real problems in terms of the frequency of the service. I think also there is a longer-term aspiration to have electrification on this route as well. And I'd certainly support the development of new stations. The station at Dalcross was an existing station many years ago, and I think that makes a lot of sense, tying in particularly with Inverness Airport. The petitioner actually makes quite an interesting point, I don't know if members have a view on, about that the ticket for trains should be clearly seated-only passengers. What the petitioner is getting at is that if any train in Scotland is too busy, that you wouldn't be allowed to stand, that there should be capacity for passengers seating only. So could I first of all just ask if members have any general views about the petition, and particularly that latter point. Dr. Carlo?
I mean, I would only observe, Convener, that I think the fortuitous announcement by Network Rail does directly address a considerable number of the issues made by the petitioner. The fact that stations will be extended to allow 6-car trains to be at them clearly increases capacity. The dualling of the line is clearly going to increase the frequency and also shorten the journey time. And I mean, I think there are a number of key journeys that can be made either by road or rail in Scotland that people shake their head in bewilderment at currently. You know, anybody trying to get to Oban by road, for example, anybody trying to get between Inverness and Aberdeen. I mean, there are certain ones we've all had experience of, and I think those of us who don't have to live with them on a daily basis count ourselves very fortunate. This does seem to me to be a long overdue but very welcome investment programme, and I suspect that it will be as much as can be hoped for in the time frame suggested to meet the needs of the petitioner. And I hope that he will feel that it has certainly addressed all of that. I have to say it was a surprise. I wasn't expecting the announcement from Network Rail particularly, but I certainly welcome it.
Thank you for that. Other members? Angus MacDonald?
Yes, thanks, Convener. I certainly agree with Jackson's comments. Certainly welcome the announcement from Network Rail. I was struck by the length of time that the journey seems to take. When I read the briefing papers, 2 hours 28 minutes does seem an excessively long period for a 108-mile journey. So I'm sure the petitioner will be pleased to note the proposed reduction in journey time, and also the introduction of 2 new stations at Dalcross and Kintor. I'm just curious, are we aware of any other rail companies in the UK who have seating-only policies for their tickets? I'm not sure if that's in operation anywhere else in the country. It might be worth finding out.
Thank you for that. Any other members wish to contribute?
Really just on the issue that you had mentioned about seated passengers, I'm not really quite sure how feasible that would be, and if that has been done before. I think we would need to seek further information on that before making any.
Well, I think that's a useful point. I think what, if members are agreeable, what I'll do is I will ask Spice if they could research this across Scotland and the UK. In fact, I'm interested to see if there's any European experiences on that. It's very much, I think the argument is, the contract with the company to travel is that you will have a seat. If there is not a seat, that's the company's obligation to provide that. I mean, clearly that would create massive problems at peak times, but I think the petitioner would argue that's the company's problem, and it's an obligation that customers are well looked after on trains. Check, Brody?
Can I, just on that, and it hasn't applied, at least not hugely in Scotland, but certainly when I lived in the southeast, one of the things that struck me with the standing, I mean, and the amount of standing, do they comply? I mean, do the operators comply with health and safety regulations?
Well, I think that's a very interesting point that I would like Spice to look at as well, because clearly in the event, in the event of an accident, standing up is more vulnerable, albeit that seats normally don't have seat belts on trains, but nevertheless, you're still more vulnerable standing. I would have thought there would be health and safety issues around that. Do the committee agree we'll ask Spice to do some look into that issue as well?
Yes. I'm slightly concerned about stringing to all of that, because I think it would be quite a big topic. I mean, in circumstances force majeure, I mean, when signalling causes trains to be cancelled and people get on, my experience is usually the train goes very much slower to reflect the fact that there are standing passengers on it. Certainly that's been my experience. And I mean, I wouldn't want the policy to be enforced in an unintended consequential way, which would be that passengers would not be able to get on trains and have to stand in the station for another 3 hours because they weren't allowed to get on one until there was a seat free. I'm not sure how you could actually apply any kind of compensation scheme, because how is somebody able to demonstrate that they were sitting or they were standing, frankly, to anybody's satisfaction after the event? So I think we're just a little bit careful we don't start wandering into territory which would require us to take very considerable evidence and mastery beyond the brief of the petition. Just, you know, because maybe we've, well, for various reasons, I suppose. So I'm slightly anxious, but I understand what you want to do.
No, I understand quite rightly, Jackson Carlo is wise to caution the committee about not extending the brief too much. But I think what I understood from the committee is at least if we ask Spice to do some brief research to see if this policy exists anywhere, that should be fairly straightforward. But I'll report that back to future committee. Now, there is a recommendation that we write to Transport Scotland Network Rail to request the views in the petition, but as members have already hinted, the announcement on Friday effectively does that. But do members still feel it would be useful to get an absolute categoric report back from Network Rail and Transport Scotland, or has that already been covered by the release that I summarised earlier?
I think it's been covered. It's covered.
How then do members feel we need to do any further work apart from the points already identified with the petition? Because clearly we would report this back to a future meeting.
So I was only going to say the one thing that might be worthwhile in asking of Network Rail is if they were able to provide a timetable over the next 5 years of when they expect this work to be undertaken. Because it was part of a broader package of announcements that were for the whole of the 5 years. Maybe it doesn't specifically state how and when this particular project will be advanced.
Okay, that's very useful. Are members agreeable we do that? Yeah. And I'll get the other point identified as well from Spice. Thank you for that. So clearly then we're going to continue this petition and ask further questions to Network Rail and to Spice and report back to a future committee. If I could just move on then to agenda item 2, it's consideration of current petitions. The next one is PE 1446 by Dr Liza Morton on behalf of the Scottish Adult Congenital Heart Patients on Scottish standards for the care of adult congenital heart patients. Members have a note by the clerk and the submissions. Malcolm Chisholm MSP is an interest in the petition and would have attended to speak. However, he's got a prior constituency engagement and could invite contributions from members. Chair Brody?
I mean, nothing other than I agree with the proposed action.
I think it's fair to say that
until we have more information by the end of the year.
I perhaps should have said that the petitioner is very keen that we do defer this petition to the end of 2014 and obtain a watching brief on the progress towards the development and implementation of national standards. Angus MacDonald?
Yes, thanks, Convener. I'm certainly pleased to note from the briefing and from questions asked in the Chamber that the issue is on the radar of the Minister for Public Health and that he's fully aware of the work of the Scottish Congenital Cardiac Network. And I'm also pleased to note that the petitioner is pleased with the establishment of the working group, which has been stated by Dr Morton, which she describes as a very positive step forward. However, I do note her request that the committee should keep a watching brief, and I would agree with Chick Brodie that we should certainly do that.
Jackson Carlo and then Anne McTaggart.
I can remember Dr Morton's evidence very vividly. It was a very forceful, compelling and well-articulated case. And I'm very happy to support the recommendation with, I think, a note in our own minutes of our very strong support for the aims of this particular petition and desire to see it succeed. Our watching brief is not one of it being out of sight and out of mind, but one very much of our expecting the work that's underway to lead to positive results and outcomes.
That, Anne McTaggart.
Thanks, Convener. Just really to commend the petitioner, Dr Lisa Morton, for the work that has been taken so far, but there is still work clearly still to be done. There has been such progress, still more progress can be done. I would most definitely agree to have the petition to remain open and a watching brief, but make sure we're watching it.
Does any other member wish to contribute? Are members happy with that course of action? And I would just endorse the comments made. I think Dr Morton gave excellent evidence to this committee. It's a very, very good petition. Then if we move to the next current petition, is PE 1480 by Amanda Capel on behalf of the Frank Capel Alzheimer's Awareness Campaign on Alzheimer's and Dementia Awareness. Members of a note by the clerk and submissions. I think that, again, this was a very strong petition. A note recently in the press, I think Alec Neil actually visited the family, and I think there was some positive publicity out of that. I think one of the key issues that I picked up on this was the importance of extending free personal care for under 65-year-olds who have dementia. And there's certainly a suggestion that we consider this petition again after the Cabinet Secretary has made a statement to Parliament and writes again to the committee on this matter. We are expecting something before Parliament very soon. Alex MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. I note in the Cabinet Secretary's letter that he states that a statement would be made later in March. So given that we're now into April and heading for the Easter recess, presumably it'll be later in April that we'll be hearing the statement, but certainly content to wait for it.
Thank you for that. Chick Brody.
Well, just two things. First of all, I know the diligence has been applied by the local member in following this through and arranging meetings with the Cabinet Secretary. And I mean, I take Angus's point that there is supposed to be a statement, which no doubt will be backdated to March. But one would hope that that might be made this week. But I think that the matter is in hand.
If members are agreeable, I'm happy to write to Alec Neil asking when the statement will be made, just so that we've got a certain time frame. Are members agreeable to that course of action? Thank you. So we'll continue the petition until we've got a note back from Alec Neil. The fifth current petition is PE 1482 by John Mormersley in isolation in single-room hospitals. Member of a note by the clerk and the submissions. Alec Ferguson MSP is an interest in this petition and would have attended today's meeting. However, he's got a prior engagement. Could invite contributions from members, but would flag up that one possible option is to write to the government seeking confirmation that patient and public views should be sought to inform the proposed review and ask whether the government is undertaking a cost-benefit analysis of 100% single rooms as opposed to 50% over the course of the hospital's lifetime, and if so, to share the information with the committee. Kind of views from members?
Yeah, if I may, Convener, I raised the question when this petition came forward regarding the expense, how much cost came in consideration, and how much might have been, leaving aside the personal aspect of it, how much might have been saved had we consulted on what's called mixed room hospitals. I think the Cabinet Secretary's letter of 19th of March lays out somewhat the estimated impact. I think one has to look at the longer-term cost in terms of the impact of non-socialisation of those patients who wish to be in or not be in single rooms, and the impact of that. I've had several representations from people who, in the medical profession, have suggested that there is a disbenefit by applying a policy of single rooms where multi-rooms can, in fact, help and assist and aid the betterment of a person's medical condition. It doesn't apply to everyone, of course, but the 50% rule initially, I'm sure, was aligned to that thought.
Thank you for that. Jackson Carlow?
Yeah, I'm kind of with the Cabinet Secretary, I think, actually, on all of this. I mean, there are people who, in response to public opinion surveys, would still prefer that we had segregated carriages on trains rather than open carriages, but you can't just provide a mix of both because people would like that. The development of a hospital is a long-term thing. It might not be easy just to reconfigure accommodation to suit at any particular given moment in time. And I have to say, politically, I have supported the government in the announcements it's made about the development of single-room hospitals for a whole variety of reasons, including infection control and whatever else that has, en-suite facilities for each patient, all manner of things that have I think, influenced me in that decision. While I think there is a role for patient opinion in all of this, the primary responsibility of the hospital is to heal the patient and have them leave hospital at the earliest possible time in the best possible health. And at the risk of saying something, I do think that there is a slightly homeopathic element into being brought into the discussion rather than a clinical one, and I'm not sure that I therefore feel moved to disagree with the Cabinet Secretary's own policy position on this.
Other members? Jim Eadie? Yeah. Right. Tried to tempt Jim Eadie to comment, but he's resisted the temptation.
Mr. Carlos' previous comments, but I think there has to be a balance. I think optimal care has to be the driver rather than cost reduction, and I think the comments from other members are largely correct in this regard.
I mean, I suppose what I'm asking the committee to views on is not to make an absolute decision whether you're in favour of 100% single rooms or not, is to say, A, should we have patient and public views should be part of this, and secondly, there's the issue about the cost-benefit analysis, which you didn't get a categorical reply to. So that's what I'm asking the committee to do now, rather than making anything definitive. Would members be agreeable to that course of action? Yeah. Is everyone agreeable? Yep. Thank you with that. The next current petition is PT 1497 by Ellie Harrison on behalf of Say No to Tesco on supermarket expansion and local high streets. Members of a note by the clerk and submissions. To invite contributions from members. There was a good response, I think, from local authorities, which is, I think, quite interesting having I looked through them all this morning. Can I first ask any general comments that members have on this particular subject? Chip Brody?
No,
sorry, Angus McDonald.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Yeah, just picking up on the response from local authorities, I was interested in the response from Falkirk Council's Chief Executive, Mary Picasely, in which she made a number of valid points, as does Alistair Mitchell, who suggested contacting of Falkirk Bid and Falkirk and District 10 Centre Management. Their comments relate mainly to Falkirk Town Centre, though. And whilst they point out that the situation there is quite different to the situation that is presented by the petitioners in the Glasgow area, there are similar concerns to the petitioners in the district centres in the Falkirk Council area, in particular Grangemouth, where a new Asda store opened just on the outskirts of the town centre and had in 2007 and had a dramatic impact on the footfall of the town centre itself, and hurt quite a number of independent retailers who are still trading, but only just. Similarly, I'm aware of, and you'll be aware, Convener, of the situation in Stornoway, where you have a Tesco and a Co-op operating on the outskirts of the town centre, and they have severely impacted on the footfall of the town centre itself. So there are a number of valid points raised in the submissions that we've received, and I have to say I do have some sympathy with the petitioners after when you see what has happened with the larger out-of-town retail stores. However, the other argument from local authorities is that smaller supermarkets, metros, etc., do seem to. Their argument is that they seem to retain a footfall in the town centres and the high streets. So it's. I would say the jury's out on this one till we see more of these smaller stores develop in our high streets.
Other members? Jackson Carlow?
I'm still not entirely persuaded. I did invite the petitioners to send us a list of the evidence-based of the stores that had closed, and in fact I spent some time in Great Western Road on Friday afternoon just to see what it was like, and I have to say there was hardly a vacant unit the length of Great Western Road. The shops were all thriving and they were busy. So I have to assume that if some units have gone in the natural course of business, other units have taken their place. I specifically took time to look for the Sainsbury's local unit, which is about halfway down between the River Kelvin and the city centre. And I looked around, and in fact I did see other fresh produce stores that were still operating within that environment. At the other end, a specific store was mentioned by the petitioners, and attribution was put down to the opening of Waitrose, but of course Waitrose in fact replaced the previous occupants of a supermarket unit there. They weren't in fact a new unit at that time. And I just wonder whether these are just what the effect of these small local supermarkets has been, whether in fact it is prejudicial as being suggested, or whether in fact they are bringing a certain amount of pizzazz and attraction to an area that had otherwise been suffering from footfall traffic, and bringing collectively more business to that area. And so with Angus MacDonald, I don't think I'm persuaded at this stage that it would be right to try and introduce any kind of restriction.
With that, to other members, Chip Road.
Just briefly, at the time, after some robust questioning, as to see why this the name had been applied, which kind of concerned me. But anyway, looking at the South Ayrshire response, and having had discussions last week about other developments in South Ayrshire, I'm somewhat concerned about the limitation that is applied to the planning process in the Class 1. Not just Class 1. I mean, we had a situation with a large toy retailer, whose name will remain nameless, but applied to have a shop in the middle of Ayr High Street, and that was turned down because it didn't fit in with the development plan or planning process. I think sometimes we micromanage things like this, and I still, I share Jackson's view that some of these shops can bring in footfall which might not enter the town, and therefore benefits as a complementary activity other shops.
Thank you. Do other members wish to contribute? I think probably the key issue then for us is do we see this as something that Scottish Government has a role over, in which case the suggestion that we ask Scottish Government about how the business rate relief is used to support small and medium businesses, or do we see it as a wider issue which is really to do with competition, which members will know is really a reserved issue which we don't really have a locus over. So it would be interesting to get members' views. Do we continue this petition and write to Scottish Government, or do we see it as a predominantly competition where we don't really have a locus?
I think there is a tension between the need to promote economic growth at all costs and actually to reflect the views of local communities. And there's been an expansion of these types of businesses in the south of Edinburgh, which I represent. And I think you do have to have a balance. You do have to take each application on its merits. But there is a concern amongst the local community that some of these developments do actually reduce the footfall for small independent traders. And I think it would be valuable to have some information on that, perhaps from the Federation of Small Businesses, to ask if they've had any feedback from their members and what the impact of the growth of the smaller supermarkets has been. But I think in terms of balancing our consideration of the issues, I know that, for example, Sainsbury's Local has opened in Marchmont, in my constituency, and they're employing, through a partnership with Remploy, people who would have trouble accessing employment within the current labour market. So there's a number of issues that have to be considered when coming to a judgment, but there is no doubt that there is concern in the south of Edinburgh about what's perceived to be the over-expansion of some of these types of businesses.
Thank you for that. Does any other member wish to?
Can I? I agree with Jimmy D in terms of consultation, but I think it's much wider than consultation has to be a process. It's looking at how development plans are developed, and also looking at the process, the definition of retail policy and what areas it applies to. I mean, for example, whether or not you have a food shop being allowed to open in a particular part of an area or not. It depends on, and then funnily enough, the policy is not applied equally across all councils. So I think there's a much wider issue involved in this than but I do take the point. I mean, clearly any application should be aware of how it impacts the community.
And just to reply to Jimmy's point, there was actually a full report from Federation Small Business, so I think that probably covers Mr. Reedy's point. Are members then agreeable that we do write to Scottish Government about the business rate relief? I take it this obviously isn't the answer to all the issues raised in the petition, but I do believe that would be useful to have that information before we make a final decision on this. Jeff Brody?
I'm not sure whether it's an issue. Yeah, I'll come back. Business rate relief and how the application of that will change a policy. I think what they have to do, as I said, we have to look at a consistency in terms of application of planning process and the areas, the sectors that it applies to within the retail, the overall, the macro retail sector in a particular area. And I'm sure that's not defined clearly enough, and certainly, I know, is different from council to council.
Well, just in reply to Chip Brody's point, I mean, what is possible is we could write to Scottish Government, ask how they do ensure consistency, and that would get round, that would answer Chip Brody's point.
Yeah, well, Convener, it would certainly be interesting to see the response to that, because in my experience, certainly in my local area, there's very little consistency. So it'd be interesting to see what the response is.
We've all experienced in our own regions or constituencies problems with urban town centres losing footfall to external developments out with towns and cities. I mean, I met one retail development the other day, and it's just a one-off, but they said to me that it's not a zero-sum game, they said, or rephrased that, they said, we are not looking to develop within cities, we want to develop on the outskirts of cities, so it's not a case of, we either develop here or we not develop at all. So I mean, there is an argument from retailers about that, but I certainly know from bid teams in my own area that they're very concerned about city centre developments and how local small family businesses are losing trade. It's a worry across Scotland, I think.
Yeah, but it's much wider than that. I mean, it's, and I can only talk about some of the towns in south of Scotland. It's not just about shops, it's about having, places to live in town centres. It's having entertainment complexes in town centres. It's having, proper transport facilities that make it easy for people to shop in town centres. So that's why I express some concern about why we're focusing on business rate relief.
But are members happy then answer to Chip Brody's point that we asked Scottish Government about the consistency of the approach, because that was Chip Brody's point, I think, and then we can look at it again at a future meeting. Members agreeable with that? Thank you for that. The final current petition is PE 1500 by Stuart Houston, OBE, on behalf of RSPB Scotland on the golden eagle as the national bird of Scotland. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. I invite contributions from members, but just before I do that, to say that the petitioner is happy for this to be continued in light of the response from the Minister for Environment and Climate Change. We may wish to accept the offer of assistance from RSPB Scotland and suggest that undertakes further work, possibly through public consultation, to enable it to demonstrate there is widespread support for the concept of a national bird and for the golden eagle over other bird species that may be worthy of consideration. I think the other issue is there was some suggestion by the Minister that we did consult other relevant committees, which would be, for example, Rural Affairs and Climate Change and Environment, and the EE and Tourism, and indeed Education and Culture. So there's a couple of points there for members I'd just like their views on. I was going to take Jackson Carroll first because well-known interest in this subject.
Rushing in where angels fear to tread, Convener. Can I say that I very much welcomed the Minister's letter, that I think, in fact, made many of the points that I did myself, but perhaps less pejoratively. But I do think that he makes 2 or 3 particular recommendations that we should follow up. And given that the Minister himself was an advocate of Scotland having a national tree, I am impressed by his caution in believing that we should have a broader discussion about the adoption of other national symbols and the process that might underpin that if it's thought desirable before we press ahead with the adoption of any particular additional national symbol. I would very much therefore welcome, in fact I think a very useful piece of work for this committee to take the lead on writing to other committees of the Parliament to establish what their thoughts, as I think you suggested there, Convener, might be on this process. And I think it would be useful if that led to some sort of It may even be that we need to take further evidence on that at some point, but if it did lead to some recommendation we could subsequently give to ministers that they might wish to consider on how the adoption of future national symbols might be achieved. And I also very much agree with the Minister who makes the point I did again, less pejoratively, that it really ought not to be for Parliament subsequently to dictate itself without really having a broader public consultation and without there having been a broader range of candidates for whatever that national symbol might be. It would be wrong for Parliament, I think, to simply dictate what the outcome of that was and going to prejudge it. And I was very taken also with the evidence we received in where I think a number from the Scottish National Heritage, who I think detailed a number of other birds. The osprey was one that struck me as one I'd made reference to subsequently, that may also be a candidate for popular affection with the public. So those two things, in a sense, I almost think, Convener, it's the principle underpinning how we might go about the adoption of future national symbols and whether those are desirable that should actually come before we progress, in essence, any particular further consultation or support for it, I think I would argue.
Yes, it's very much a route map for future symbols. That's, I think, a very good point. Other members' contributions? Are members happy? I think the points I made and Jackson Carr made are very similar, actually, so in terms of recommendation for next steps. But really, I think it shows that I think we need to take some sort of leadership over the wider issue here. And are members agreeable we write to the other committees that have identified and pursue the point? Thank you very much for that. Then could I formally close the meeting and allow just a few seconds for members to leave the galley? And if members could wait behind, there's a couple of administrative issues I just want to raise. So I formally close the meeting.